Hey guys, Mr. V over here doing a book review today for The Faithful Executioner by Joel F. Harrington. This is a nonfiction book, and this is basically the biography, or you can call it semi-biography, of a professional executioner in the late 1500s and early 1600s. Because this executioner, what he did was he took a journal throughout his life. And then what the author did was he went through and read his journal and gave you bits and pieces of his journal but put it in more modern terms. And the author also um, mixes it of history from that time period, which was Germany in the late 1500s and early 1600s. So you get a very clear picture of what this executioner's life was like. You also get a clear picture of what just overall life was like in that time frame. Now, before considering this book, I would say you should be over the age of 18 because, as I said, it is the journal of a professional executioner. So you probably want to be over the age of 18 because he talks about executions, tortures, punishments, and while it's not in-depth graphically, so you don't need to worry about that, it still talks about the executioner and someone who executed close to 400 people. He also disfigured many others, over 100 people. So, as I said, just the topic alone, you probably want to be over the age of 18. And but I would say, if you are interested in the book, it is definitely a very interesting book. I don't want to call it entertaining, but it definitely was interesting. It's kind of weird if you call the life of an executioner entertaining, but it definitely has a big interest to it because you not only learn of the life of the executioner, but you learn a lot of outside of the executioner's life. So that's why it is definitely a very interesting book because the author, what he does here is he shows what living in the 1500s was like. And you get to see, like, it was a very tough life because the death rate of birth was very high. But there are also, like, many diseases for adults. Adults did not live as long in that time frame because there were so many diseases. There was many epidemic outbreaks like smallpox or the plague. And you just get to see that life. I mean, as I told you, you don't just read the executioner's journal, you read his life and what life was like. And you see that he lived in a tougher time period. The 1400s to 1700s was called the Little Ice Age. And that's because there were colder winters, there was more rain, there was more flooding, there was fewer crops, fewer animals, more famine, and all of this led to more crime. So, and especially stealing. So that led to more punishments, where that would lead to more executions, and that's where this guy's life came into be a lot more. Something that surprised me when I was reading the book from that time frame was that executions were used for a wide array of crimes. I did not know that, because it was not just the extremes like murder. We think of that today, that okay, they just executed people for the extremes, as I said, like murder. But no, they executed for even things as minor as stealing, because that time period found prisons very costly. So many times they didn't even want to put people in prisons. They would kind of just banish you from the town or execute you. So it was a pretty brutal, and you get to see how many people are executed for what we would consider minor crimes. And it just shows that. But what he also shows in the book is he shows how many skills are involved with being an executioner. Because also, I would also say like our vision of an executioner is actually very different than what like the movies portray, all that. The real life one was very different, and he goes through all that kind of stuff. And but it was very tough because not only did they look different than we think, but they needed to execute properly. And that means without mistakes. Because he lived in a time before the guillotine and even hanging, they didn't have the drop board, anything like that. So he had to execute properly. And also there was many forms of execution. I don't remember how many he discussed, but there were many forms. And the executioner needed to know all that because sometimes they wanted a different form, all that kind of stuff. And he was not only the executioner, but he was the town punisher because I told you he already disfigured hundreds of people because he would sometimes have to do the floggings or do other things like that. But lastly, he was also the interrogator. So he would sometimes also have to do torture methods, and it's pretty brutal. Again, he doesn't go that in depth. You don't get it graphically like imagine it, but he still talks about it a little bit because it was his journal. So you can see though how mentally tough the executioner had to be. And not only were those the aspects that the executioner had to do, but many people did not like executioners. And it wasn't because, oh, they thought they were going to get executed. It wasn't anything like that. But they just thought of executioners as the lower class people. So, it was hard to marry people. And again, they were just lower class. So it was like, they didn't want you marrying it. Or if you had kids, they didn't want you to be with the kids. Things like that. So, sorry, your kids could not be with other kids. Things like that. Couldn't go to certain schools. Anything like that. Because, again, you were the lower class. But lastly, the other part was he needed a lot of people skills because you needed the town leaders to hire you. Someone had to do the job, obviously, but you had to talk to the town leaders and convince them you were the right one over another executioner. So you had to have all those people skills. And when you see all this in the book, you're like, wow, there's a lot more to it than you think. And another surprising thing I learned in the book was that he knew and helped healing people. He helped everyday people heal wounds, such as just normal everyday cuts and things like that, but also broken bones, any of those types of things, because he saw a lot of these things, like during torture, he would have to do this to people, but then also heal them so that they could be executed properly. I know we find that very weird, but that's what they wanted to do. But because of that, he could help just the everyday person get healed. The journal claimed he healed over 15,000 people. The author does state that he's not sure on those numbers. He thinks that's exaggerated or is not giving the correct number, but it still showed that he healed a lot of everyday people, even though if you cut the number in half. He still healed a lot of everyday people. And those are things that I never would have thought. And he even devotes a whole section to the healing of that. Now, some of the things I did not like about the book was he gave very long chapters. Give you a comparison, the audio version, the chapters were about 2 hours each. And while there were sub-chapters in between, the whole chapter was still very long. And another thing that was a little tough was that some parts were a little random. I'll give you an example. He would give you his feelings about different types of criminals, and then he would talk about it for 2 pages and then just move to a completely different subject. And it wasn't bad. I'm not gonna say it was bad. It was just a little weird sometimes to just jump subjects. And he just threw in a lot of different aspects, and it was never too in-depth, but he covered a lot of different aspects. And the last thing I would say was that while the whole book was pretty good, it's not too long of a book, you can see it's not that long of a book, I would say about the first 50% was the most interesting. The last 50% was still interesting, but it was not as interesting. I still think the first 50%, first half, was much better. But overall, this was a well-written book. I think it keeps your interest throughout. He never goes too far in depth, which I think is a good thing. And he only had limited sources. He had to go off this one guy's journal. So he never goes too far in depth, but it was enough to want to keep you reading. And I think that was a great aspect. And I would say that I definitely enjoyed the read. I enjoyed the read. And while I would not highly recommend this book, I recommend it to people who are interested in kind of an unusual biography based off some of the things I just said. But it's a very unusual biography, and prepare for it to be an unusual biography in those regards. Or if you're also interested in just a brief history of Europe, or specifically Germany in the late 1500s and early 1600s, and what it was like living in some of those small towns. But if you guys have any comments, please post it in the comment section below, because I always love to hear your comments, your opinions. If you guys enjoyed the book review today, hit the subscribe button, as I always upload multiple different book reviews. So, thank you for watching my book review today. Go enjoy your reading.